Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Goedenavond iedereen. Apus Architecture in Belgium and Bozar realiseren een uitgebreid cultureel programma van lezingen, discussies en tentoonstellingen hier in het Paleis voor Schone Kunsten. Ce soir, Daniel Norell et Einar Rodhe ont été sollicités pour venir nous présenter une sélection de projets représentatifs de leur pratique architecturale. Leur approche s'apparente souvent à une démarche artistique dans laquelle la conception d'objets, d'architecture et d'installation se mélangent. Het bureau werd in 2012 opgericht in Stockholm door Daniel Norell et Einar Rodhe. Ils ont acquis une certaine notoriété en Suède et à l'international, en Suède où la majorité de leurs projets résidentiels et culturels ont été réalisés. Norell Rodhe ziet architectuur als een culturele praktijk, waarbij elk project een eigen verhaal ontwikkelt en de architecten in gesprek gaan met de stad en haar inwoners. Ils ont participé à plusieurs expositions collectives, telles que la Triennale d'architecture d'Oslo en 2019 et la Biennale d'architecture de Venise en 2018. De lezingenreeks van 2023 wordt mogelijk gemaakt door een aantal instanties die wij graag willen bedanken voor hun steun. De sponsor van deze lezing, Assemblage, onze structurele partner Febelsem, onze structurele sponsor Dieteren IMO, de Vlaamse overheid, la ville de Bruxelles, la région de Bruxelles-Capitale ainsi que la Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles. Je tiens aussi bien évidemment à remercier Bozar pour avoir coproduit cet événement avec A+. Et now, please welcome Daniel Norell and Einar Rodhe. Merci.
Good evening.
All right, hi everyone. Really nice to be here. It's a great pleasure to be speaking at the Bozar this evening. Thank you, Laura and Lisa, for inviting us. We have recently, with our practice, had the opportunity to spend a little time here in Belgium, something we have enjoyed immensely. So there's a certain strain of contemporary architecture here that resonates somehow with our work. In its attention to qualities in what's already existing and in kind of strange mixtures between the everyday, let's say, and the fictional. We are Norell Rodhe, a small practice based in Stockholm. So I'm Einar, this is Daniel. So our practice has grown a little bit lately. So last year we moved into a new studio space with more space, let's say, and more people. The studio is located on the ground floor of an old 1930s Leverents building in Stockholm, so designed by Sigurd Leverents some almost 100 years ago. Our studio, that's a place where we work, where we draw, write, make things, and so on. So it's a place for production, a workshop. But it's also an archive of old models and mock-ups, for instance. When we started the practice, we were both teaching at the KTH in Stockholm, but since some time I teach at Konstfack, a school of, or a University of Arts, Crafts and Design in Stockholm, whereas Daniel teaches on the west coast at Chalmers. This is an image from our previous office space just before we left it. We kind of like this image because it's aligned with how we view architecture. We have an interest in how architecture can come about by combining and reappropriating what's already around us. That could be on a site or in the city, or like here, literally around us, at the desk where we work, and where old ideas, objects can get a new life by acts of translation.
So taking part in exhibitions and publications has become an integrated part of our practice. It's a way for us to stay in dialogue with other practices, theorists, curators, and other disciplines. Perhaps this is also one of the reasons why we're interested in architectural representation. So how to communicate and convey architecture across media such as drawings, photographs, texts, models, mock-ups, and of course buildings. There is also another side to this interest in representation. When built, architecture can communicate meaning and trigger memories. Buildings, or even a kiosk in an exhibition, can have cultural significance. Although often acting as a background, buildings frame everyday life, and sometimes they can even stand at the center of an event. Here's a shot from an opening night of an exhibition at Arkites in Stockholm, where with the kiosk we designed standing as a kind of majestic figure in a sea of small people. So our entry for the Skellefteå Cultural Center in northern Sweden for a competition became an opportunity to explore this idea of architecture and its cultural importance at a different scale. So the premise of the competition was that the city wanted to collect several existing cultural institutions into a new major hub for culture and events. So we interpreted these institutions as building blocks or as separate buildings. And here we see those buildings assembled into what we call the supergroup. So each building mass in the center we designed corresponds to one of the existing institutions in the town. There's a theater in green, a library rotonda in white, a conference center in yellow, and the art galleries in red. And they were all arranged on a plinth that faces adjacent public spaces. So thinking about architecture as an assemblage is interesting to us because it allows for multiple adjacencies, identities, and overlaps between programs. The project also, and this approach, resulted in an almost Pyrenean interior, an urban condition with junctions, piazzas, and landmarks, a city consisting solely of tightly packed architecture. So here we see the first floor plan with theaters, auditoria, and upper foyers. Here's a competition that we did win for an observation tower in Latvia. So the tower that we designed stands as a majestic figure in the landscape of a nature reserve, looking out at various surrounding scenes. It consists of a vertical gridded framework that scaffolds several discrete architectural features that dramatically cantilevers from it. So it's again a project that begins as an assemblage of parts, of features, or of objects. So each feature or add-on would direct views towards a particular vista in the surrounding landscape, hence the title of the project, the Tower of Many Views. So here a round balcony at one of the lower floors, and tiny openings in the wall would frame almost like postcard scenes from a picturesque village. The view from the stair halfway up, or an expansive oculus windows that directs views towards vast woodlands. So together, the varying views set the basis for a continuously unfolding narrative that links the tower to the specificity of the landscape surrounding it. And finally, an I am flying balcony at the top that offers panoramic views high above ground. And here we see the tower situated in the landscape. So the tower becomes a viewing machine, a vertical collection of framing devices. Unfortunately, the competition will not be realized, but a few months after we received that message, we were invited by a museum to make a large-scale model at scale 1:5. So here's the 7-meter-tall version of the tower in an exhibition that opened at Bildmuseet in Umeå last year in northern Sweden. So we love models, and in particular big models. So this was a rare opportunity to explore a scale that sits ambiguously in between representation and the real thing. And here one gets a sense of the scale of the piece in relation to the elevator doors down in the bottom of the image.
All right, so now on to some examples of private residences that we've been working on lately. And several of these residences are houses that explore a kind of playful monumentality through composition, proportions, fenestrations, etc. How can one make a 120 square meter house kind of still seem big and significant? We often end up considering a quite distinct massing where the house becomes an object, a discrete entity in the landscape. It says here in Swedish, I don't know if there's any Swedes in the room, but it says, this is the house for the old chicken lady. It's a very kind of basic log cabin, but it's kind of its roof and its symmetry, they start to almost suggest a small temple. And when a client of us asked us to replace this house, to actually kind of demolish it and replace it with a villa, we instead proposed an extension. So the new house, it touches the old just enough to make a connection. And along with a third building, they start to shape a series of outdoor spaces. A recessed entrance place to the street, a loggia-like facade to the west, mirroring existing trellis structures. Yeah, here we can see the street facade and also the old mansion which the chicken house once belonged to. And the new house becomes this slightly larger sibling, let's say, to the chicken house. The side slopes towards a deep bay of the Baltic Sea. A view towards the garden, and from outside on the sort of the place where the building stands on stilts, let's say. And then the interior walls of this building were all rendered in clay, which allowed for these kind of soft filleted corners. Okay, so like many architects, we are often asked to do a lot on a limited budget. So this summer house for a young family who had bought a small lot just south of Stockholm in a pastoral landscape characterized by mixed forest and open fields. This house became that's an example of that, let's say. And to increase a sense of privacy in relation to the neighbors, we proposed two walls. So it's one actual wall on the right-hand side in this drawing, and then a wall-like house on the other side. The neighbors here, they are ordinary, but not ordinary in a beautiful way, but kind of ordinary in a just ordinary way. So we thought it was good for the house to shield them off somehow. And there is this veranda or loggia that opens to the garden, and then a small circular patio on the back of the house. And the interior is basically one enlonged space that is loosely divided into social and private spheres that extend onto the veranda, which kind of spans the full length of the house. Yeah, again, as Daniel said, we enjoy making those kind of quite big models to explore the architecture. Here, the exterior has a rhythm of post and raft details, against which there is this play between different geometrical openings. Okay, so approaching the site, a small pitched gable appears on a gently sloping hill facing a field. Coming closer and moving up the hill into the garden, now the main facade is revealed, fronted by the veranda. And the veranda, it creates this backdrop against which domestic life as well as vegetation can unfold. And yeah, on a rainy day like this one, the veranda becomes an in-between space where you can enjoy the garden through this curtain of water thanks to this gutterless roofing. And then the sense of order that the facade brings is sort of loosened once we enter the house. The interior is an open space that has been furnished with 4 monomaterial masses, let's say, and together with shifts in floor levels, these masses loosely define the spaces. The living room with sliding doors to the larger bedroom, which still is very, very small. And when the doors slide, they start to reveal other colors and materialities. And these kinds of houses, they are an ongoing work in progress to us. We enjoy designing single-family houses because, there is often this quick process where one potentially can pack quite a lot of architecture in a really small envelope. And the view back across the field. Okay, so sometimes we do apartments and interiors as well. And most buildings in central Stockholm, where we have the projects, are built somewhere in between 1880 and 1930. So there is often this, let's say, historical aspects to take into account. Especially the apartment here, it explores a similar approach to the small house that we just showed, where the interior happens, or sort of where much of the design happens in between the scale of furniture and architecture, let's say. And together a series of spatial relations makes the room seem spacious and varied, despite their kind of relatively modest size. And we designed this apartment for a family that then kind of grew and moved into a larger one, which we are currently working on. With this type of work, there are often this typical request from a client that want to kind of rethink the space plan so it better suits the life of today. And we often find ourselves kind of negotiating this while somehow kind of paying attention to the origin of the building and the character of the existing architecture. So this is an ongoing work, let's say, but now onto some more speculative practices or projects.
So for some time now we have been working on how architecture can come about by collecting, altering and recombining existing things. So it's about things that start from other things or things that might have been lost and found. We're interested in how used building elements and materials can contribute to a shift in mindset in architecture. This is something we have explored in several speculative projects for exhibitions. So first we'll talk about a few of those projects and then we'll finish up with a couple of building scale projects. So there is often an element of surprise when designing with existing things that are appropriated for other purposes. The strip light fixtures that we used in the design of this table, for example, had detailing and technical parts that became unhooked from function and meaning. So the detailing somehow acquired a new significance in the transformation from function to ornament or decoration. So when we were assembling these chairs from various found elements, including a structure from an existing chair, the question of authorship became apparent. The structure that we used for the chair or the skeleton turned out to be from a chair designed in the 1990s by a known Swedish designer, Jonas Ostlund. So when we first showed the project, Jonas happened to be in the audience. So he stood up and said, "That's my chair." So who is the author of this chair? Maybe not us as much as him. So in the novel Invisible Cities, Italo Calvino tells a story about a city called Clarice, where the same building elements are continuously rearranged on an urban scale. So Calvino said, the capitals could have been in the chicken runs before they were in the temples. The marble urns could have been planted with basil before they were filled with dead bones. Only this is known for sure. A given number of objects is shifted within a given space, at times submerged by a quantity of new objects, at times worn out and not replaced. The rule is to shuffle them each time, then try to assemble them. So thinking about this fictional city, we made a small model for an exhibition in Italy many years ago. So to situate ourselves in Clarice, we went on a scavenger hunt in our studio, collecting just the smallest and most beautiful objects that we could find and assemble them into this facade, or this sort of broken facade. A couple of years ago, we received an invitation to design and install a large-scale version of the piece in an exhibition called Architectures of Transition, curated by Portuguese architect Pedro Gadanho. So what if architecture with its convention of strong part-to-whole relationships would be developed using discrete objects from radically different origins? So for the exhibition, we developed a colossal model of the same facade made of used building elements that we found in demolition sites, markets for used materials, and recycling centers throughout Stockholm. And here you see those elements laid out and sorted on the floor of our old studio. So when assembled, the elements form a structure based on a 1 meter grid. And working with non-standard objects as building components, an obvious issue in this project was that all details had to be custom designed. And these drawings were part of a set of construction drawings that we developed for the project, and they show how wildly different elements and chunks of materials come together to form columns. An issue was also that the project was installed and the exhibition opened during COVID, so there was no possibility for us to be around when the technicians put the pieces together, so therefore we had to develop really precise documentation. The design was also conceived using partial mock-ups in our studio and a digital model that incorporated material qualities such as glossiness and patina. Oops. The composition explores the different aging of materials as well. So solid aluminum profiles, for instance, even if they're really old, have, as you know, literally no signs of age, while other materials can have a lot of patina. So here's the 5-meter tall structure in the exhibition hall at the museum. So based on the building elements' qualities, materiality, color, scale, patina, etc., we developed a loose associative order that sort of told us where the different elements would go. So the city is filled with stuff, objects and architecture. How can a close look at such existing material, the way it's used, its genesis and varying temporality, as well as the flows that supports it, be turned into a proposition for architecture? This work was an attempt to begin to study the question of how architecture can incorporate elements from radically different origins and still somehow make sense as a whole. Another thing we wanted to do with these kinds of projects is to understand the life of building materials. Like, for instance, what happens to elements and materials when buildings come to an end? Since around 5-6 years, we have been doing a series of excursions and scavenger hunts where we visit demolition sites, different outlets for used building elements, recycling centers, and even active landfills, to talk to people who work in this flow of used materials. And on such visits, we sometimes collect used materials such as concrete rubble, plastics, bit of plasterboard, and steel studs, etc. So here are 2 markets for used building elements in Stockholm. These 2 spaces are fascinating to us, but in different ways. They're both densely packed with architectural elements, but their atmospheres are radically different. One is sort of nostalgic with dimmed lighting in a barn. The other one is industrial and brightly lit. And during these trips, a demolition worker told us that these building elements are the ones that are valued today. So i.e. the elements that are either very old and have a lot of character, or the ones that are really new and are standardized. But the rest, what makes up most of the built environment to us, around us, still has no real value once it's deinstalled. So on a visit to a large waste processing plant in South Stockholm, we learned that this pile or this mountain of trash contains one of the lowest forms of waste. It's a mixture of materials and stuff that is not possible to reuse or recycle. It will most likely go to landfill. Ironically, the name of this plant, this waste plant, is recycling plant, but far from everything is recycled, of course. Here's an active landfill in the same plant where building parts and other waste materials are buried deep underground. It was once a strip mine, and now this wound in the landscape is being concealed gradually with garbage. The waste is protected with a waterproof layer below and above, so the whole thing becomes like a wrapped-in gift to future generations. And this is not an archive photograph, this is ongoing practice in Sweden.
All right, so with these thoughts in mind, we developed a project called Under Construction for the 2019 Architecture Triennale in Oslo, in Norway. So inspired by the Calvino text that Daniel mentioned, we imagined this city where new constructions are built solely out of used objects and materials, forming these kind of anachronistic cityscapes that are neither dystopic nor futuristic. So the project came out as a playful fiction with immediate ties to the grit of the real world, where the city becomes an archive of stuff, continuously transforming as building elements are reappropriated to other activities or uses. And giving materials and building elements a second life is a logistical challenge, a problem of procurement, building codes, material flows, etc. But as architects, we realize that this is as much a cultural and designerly problem. One of the most persistent architectural conventions is to consider abstract space before material entities. Building elements and materials should be subservient to a larger whole. And to us, this approach is aligned with a view on the world that is inherited from industrialism, where anything can be sourced and anew and kind of molded into shape indefinitely, as if the world was sort of endless. But working with found objects, the design process is flipped around as we instead depart from something which is very concrete and physical. Objects, chunks of material start to take priority over organization and composition. And each found element comes with a set of qualities, a character, let's say, that may be amplified, subverted, or altered. So the under construction neighborhood that we designed for the Oslo Triennale, it centers around this local market crowned by a soft sculptural roof. And as further responses to principles principles linked to flows of used goods and recycling, each one of the 5 houses consists of one type of material, let's say. And this mono-material approach corresponds to a thinking of materials in terms of fractions throughout their life cycle, something that significantly increases their possibilities for future disassembly and recycling. So each building here becomes a depot of materials, which later can be rearranged into something else. And working with this project became an opportunity to somehow playfully cycle through architectural references. So here we can see some, perhaps John Hayduck-like anti-dove spikes arranged on some metal light diffuser to create a specific character. And here plasterboards becoming concrete slabs, or plastic panels repurposed as giant waffle slabs, like in Toyoito's Sendai Mediatek, if anyone remember that building. Each type of material seemed to suggest its own logic in terms of detailing and in terms of assembly. In general, we're interested in acts of translation, like here, where accidental marks get a new meaning. And together, these buildings forms a fictional neighborhood with streets and plazas. So an aim with this project was to link the design and the construction of the model here to the material flows that the project seeks to address. And there's obviously a play with representation going on. Qualities belonging to the collected pieces, like materiality and patina, reinforce a reading of them as being real and undisguised, but at the same time, the model makes it quite clear, I guess, that they could be read as representing something other than themselves. The Triennale in Oslo, it was themed the architecture of degrowth, where Interurban, the curators, they explored this idea of degrowth to limit endless extraction of materials and natural resources. How can architecture respond to this in terms of practice, aesthetics, urban life, etc.? And of course, such thinking can be linked to the past. Being here in Brussels now, I can imagine that many of you are quite aware of architecture's rich history of designs that departs from a used stock of materials. Reuse was common in pre-modern and in postmodern times, and here illustrated with spolia on the left-hand side, where from the kind of Middle Ages and the quirky practice of ad hocism of the late 1960s. And one thing that perhaps these two examples have in common is that they kind of displace and recontextualize objects from their normal setting or normal function. And in pursuing work of this kind, we have noted that used building elements often have qualities and dimensions that resist standard means of architectural representation and production. So here are a few slides of a small research project called Completions that outlines an approach to reuse where building elements are integrated into new assemblages by means of 3D scanning and fabrication. So the project surveys or completes or repairs elements found in a state of disrepair with adjoining parts. Okay, so this work explores how the exactitude and rich materiality of models obtained with 3D scanning can provide an alternative to the abstractions that comes with typical CAD drawings. The scanning process, unlike the eye of the human that is conducting a survey, does not discriminate, let's say, between what has been intentionally designed and what is circumstantial, such as the patina in this old window frame. This ability to see objects devoid of human preconception resonates with a speculative reuse practice. Okay, so taking cues from spolia and ad hocism, our completions lie somewhere in between dutiful repairment and an exquisite corpse. So here the completed window frame where two of the sawn-off ends are effortlessly bridged, or let's say effortlessly. By playing with straight edges and fractured edges of leftover marble sheets, these fragments of marble start to form a grotto-like mantelpiece. And here a detail where the edge of one stone is cut to kind of perfectly match the randomly fractured edge of the other through water jet. And finally, a double door where the wear and tear of the original door is transferred over to the matching new piece. So again, suddenly accidental characters of the one piece here worn of paint and shifts in color kind of start to suggest a reading of them as being intentional articulation. Okay, so to depart from something existing is not necessarily about reuse in a practical sense to us. It could also be about seeing and about paying attention to what is there. And here, sort of the final of this series of small research-based projects, this project addresses the domestic interior, or the home, let's say. So the starting point here was a careful documentation of occupied rental apartments in different locations in Stockholm using a laser scanner. So we were interested in the relation between the architectural framework of a room, the floors, walls, ceiling, and all the furniture and stuff that dwells in it. And here a view of an occupied living room with its arrangement of objects, but without the framework of the room. So the project, it considers stuff, furniture, objects, belongings, etc., as a resource and as an architectural entity with an impact that may exceed the architecture of the space, like walls, floors, etc. Yeah, and for these studies, we used the possibility of careful clippings to take a closer look at different situations and groups of everyday objects. This became a way for us to explore things like hierarchy, adjacencies between furniture, architecture, and objects. Coming closer, this work has been an opportunity to, we see it as an open-ended study on everyday life and situations, where the domestic interior is read through the lens of architectural representation, a representation that breaks disciplinary distinctions between architecture, furniture design, etc. And with these studies as a starting point, we made a small exhibition, and it's set in this apartment building from the 1960s on Södermalm in Stockholm. And the exhibition was called Alive Interior, and it explored shifting notions of the architectural interior and its objects, representations, narratives, etc. And we were able to rent this apartment for a few months because the entire building was being emptied in preparation for a larger alteration. And we could use these spaces as our atelier and make experiments and in making preparations for the exhibition, working both with drawings and representations and assemblages of found objects. So at the opening, there were several different kinds of objects on display in the apartment: printed drawings, new furniture pieces, installations, etc. Yeah, and we were also interested in highlighting the marks and the traces that past occupants had left here, such as kind of the wear and tear and the layers of installations, wallpapers, paint, etc. We staged this exhibition as a home, with a living room and here the kitchen, with this kind of ad hoc table constructed from remodeled cabinet doors. And in connection to the project, we displayed the images from many of those excursions that Daniel mentioned, which kind of studies where building elements but also furniture end up once they leave our homes or once buildings are destroyed, demolished. And this wall became an opportunity to display this. Reuse stores, charity shops, recycling centers, waste plants, etc. And with inspiration from the scans and from the mappings, we did a series of furniture pieces, like this plastic debris table. And here finally some chairs we designed and constructed by altering and recombining fragments of found objects.
So we wanted to end the talk with two projects that build on this thinking, but in a much more concrete way. So if you look close enough, very few buildings are static. Here is a historical survey of an old Navy building in central Stockholm. It was once built as a small single-level storage in the early 18th century that you see outlined here in black. And it has since then grown gradually throughout several hundred years in all directions. We feel for this building because it tries to look proud and proper, but if you pay attention, you see conflicts and negotiations all over. So the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm asked us to transform the ground floor of the building into a new home for students and faculty working with photography, moving images, and performance art. So here's the exterior of the building as it stands today, and as you can see, it has a strong sense of unity that almost completely disguises the fact that it's a building that is an assemblage of extensions. So as you might know, Stockholm is a city built on islands. In the center of the image you have the old town, and to the right of that is a smaller island called Skeppsholmen. An island once dedicated to shipbuilding and to the Navy, now home to several cultural institutions, including the Museum of Modern Art. And after suffering a big fire a few years ago, the Institute of Art is now growing again using the building stock of the island. So the island becomes like a campus for the Institute. And the building that we've been working with in this project is the black building to the north. And the Institute's main building is the larger gray building in the south, a building that we're currently doing a major transformation of that I talk more about in a minute. So our transformation of the building treats it as a found object, and the design aims at turning old accidents into architecture, essentially. So for example, in the 19th century, as the building had to grow vertically, an architecture professor at the institute added structure to support the upper floors, the braced timber posts placed in front of the windows that you see here. So the drawing shows how we insert a new partition wall to create seminar rooms further towards the back, and how this wall becomes a backdrop for the posts, and how the windows are projected then to form new windows. So the project was a response to a new, less hierarchical model for art education developed by the Institute, and one where faculty, students, and workshop staff are grouped around a subject rather than around and based on academic rank. So here we can see discursive spaces, so seminar rooms, etc., towards the bottom of the plan, and spaces for production, such as a film studio, towards the top. And solving the circulation was also an issue, as this building is protected and we weren't allowed to make new openings larger than 5 centimeters in the load-bearing walls. So we started the project with an inventory of the spaces as well as of other hidden resources of the Institute. To the left is one of the timber posts, and as you can see, it was completely cluttered by later additions. And we wanted to sort of unclutter it and emphasize it. And the image in the middle shows a set of beautiful chairs in the school's extensive warehouse that were designed in the mid-1990s by Swedish furniture designer Karin Norell. And scouting the Institute, we also found some old stoneworks that were samples from students' and professors' work. Most of the photographs that I will show now were taken by our friend Mikael Olsson just before the school opened. Being an art school, the rooms are now, both luckily and sort of unluckily, gradually transforming beyond our control. So this is a student and faculty lounge, loosely programmed space for spontaneous work, for lunches, coffee, and conversation, and actually social and discursive spaces like this, where students and faculty would meet, were an important part of the brief. So here a professor would organize lunches once a month for staff and students, where they would cook together and discuss specific topics. We also designed a series of furniture pieces that were especially made for the project, including this greenish concrete table. There's also a play with the permanence going on here, so the structure, the timber posts that are a permanent feature of the building become playful through articulation with color, while the furniture, the table, is made of concrete and appears as something very permanent, in fact. So adjacent to the lounge is a kitchenette clad in stainless steel, and a shelving that has been custom fitted to the column. Circulation spaces without daylight were painted in a dark hue that works in shadowy conditions. Throughout the project, most surfaces were clad in standard materials, so we thought it would be a good idea to develop a kind of color scheme to bring more life to the building and to the rooms and structures. And here you see a model shot that shows the relationship between the timber posts and the windows, and that you can see that they're somehow both sort of in sync and out of sync with each other. And there was also a library and a project room that could be appropriated for different purposes by the students and faculty. And another example of a historical remnant was this overhead crane from the Navy era that was left. And with the curtains drawn, the same space is turned into a movie theater. So in some rooms like this one, we opted for flexibility through movable furniture and installations. And in other spaces, it was key to stick to something more robust that couldn't be fiddled around with by the students, such as the green concrete table. So the project kind of negotiates flexibility and order. And here the film studio. A niche in the faculty lounge with a bespoke unit for books and storage. And overall, the project transforms the existing interior through many small and precise additions like this one, rather than through a budget and time-consuming total makeover. Here, finally, the space filled with people. It's the inauguration with students, faculty, and guests gathered around our big table. With the cooking session and the performance oddly happening in parallel. This project led to a larger commission to transform the interior of the Institute's main building, which is a project that we're currently working on. And this project comes with a slightly different set of problems, as it consists of a military barracks building from the 1700s to the left and an extension from the mid-1990s to the right.
All right, so we are now at the last project for tonight. And I know that there won't be any kind of Q&A session after this, but if you feel that you want to kind of ventilate some criticism or have comments or questions, feel free to kind of grab us afterwards. It's always fun with some kind of feedback, let's say. Okay, I don't know if you've heard about this city. It's called Kiruna. It's on the very north of Sweden, in a kind of Arctic situation. It's a city that currently is being relocated a few kilometers because it rests on an iron ore that has been mined to the point at which it makes the ground that the city stands on sort of unstable. And here we see the new city hall and what will be the new city center, situated right next to this old abandoned mining area that we have engaged with recently. So we have worked on a project for, let's say, that area, let's say. So commissioned by the state and by the city and by the new European Bauhaus initiative, we were asked to come up with a plan for how to develop this area, including these beautiful buildings. And for the project, we teamed up with those figures that you can see here from our first site visit. It's Britta Marakatlabba, an artist, and it's a landscape designer called Sam Keshavarts, and a sociologist named Eugenia Segerstedt. And the project has been a lot about sort of working for and with the local community. On our visits to Kiruna, we have met with many different stakeholders with an interest in this site. It has been really interesting, kind of meeting local associations and business owners, as well as kind of representatives of the Gabna Sami village. The indigenous people in northern Sweden, they are repressed. And when we had a meeting with them in the new city hall, it was the first meeting with the city over many, many years, even though they are constantly being sort of stressed by the activities here. We also consulted historical researchers that had kind of detailed knowledge about the history of the site and about the mining fields. And we also did a workshop with school children in the city. Okay, so this image tries to explore somewhat what's happening here. We see our site, it's called Tulavara. That's the yellow area in the right, to the right, let's say, in the context of Kiruna as a whole. The site lies in the intersection of many of those interests or activities that have shaped Kiruna. So you have the mining industry, the Sami culture, or the indigenous people and their reindeer herding, the mountains, and lately now the move from the old Kiruna to the new Kiruna. So just north of the site in blue, there's this long path where the reindeer are driven in the spring and in the fall by members of the Gabni Sami village. And then you have this kind of large yellow area to the left that shows the extent of the deformation zone. So all buildings in this area are now sinking due to mining underground. And there's a kind of quick diagram trying to explore this on the left-hand side. And we see this kind of large demolition project as an opportunity for a large-scale and systematic reuse of building elements and materials. And our vision for the city is based on the idea that elements and materials, and even whole buildings, will start to kind of migrate from the old Kiruna to the new site in Tuolavara. And when it comes to smaller heritage buildings in wood, Kiruna has already developed procedures for moving them on trucks. So this is what's happening in Kiruna now. They take down signs, they kind of clear the way, and then they are able to kind of drive one of those houses. And they have done so with, I think, around 30 buildings. But larger buildings are typically just demolished without ambitions for reuse. So this is the old city hall, a really kind of fantastic building, which they took down and crushed into pieces. They took some artworks and some of the finest interiors were saved, and they took the door handle of that building and put it on the new building. But beyond that, there wasn't much of kind of ambitions on saving building materials. So in our project, we propose a scenario in which all buildings, or any kind of buildings, in the demolition zones from all periods would be systematically inventoried to identify parts that could be suitable for reuse. It could be, let's say, individual building elements, such as columns, beams, windows, and so on, but also kind of larger chunks, like parts of facades or floor slabs. And here we have kind of cropped portions of really large modernist buildings from the old Kiruna. And here an elevation that shows the idea of this project to create a new neighborhood around the abandoned mine in Tuolavara. Our plan is to make it kind of completely through reuse, and we choose to work with kind of small scale, and we hope to kind of be able to start with a few experimental houses and then kind of build from that. Yeah, and this model also shows on the left-hand side the new city center, which is built with the European city as a model, with 6-story tall closed city blocks and narrow streets. And that might be really beautiful, but at this latitude, with the low sun, it also means a really dark city. So with our work, we wanted to point in another direction. Our sketch draws inspiration from the Sami building culture, which has a much more, let's say, take what you have at hand approach. Something that typically results in small-scale architecture built with locally sourced materials. So these buildings, we hope they will be kind of constructed from parts of buildings from the old Kiruna, either like collages of several buildings or by rebuilding a fragment of a large building. And in the center, we have proposed a greenhouse as a kind of direct result of the meeting we had with school children and their wishes. And you can also perhaps see this portal in the back that kind of is a reconstruction of an historical entrance gate to the mine. It shows the way to recreational landscapes behind the towers. And here, the existing brick buildings surrounded by our new buildings, including the yellowish building constructed from parts of the Swedish architect Ralph Erskine's iconic residential building in Old Kiruna, which is being demolished right now. And in the back, some footpaths that sort of extend out to the landscape. The sensibility of this set of drawings were influenced by our team member Britta Marakatlaba and her monumental embroideries on Sami culture. Okay, now we are finally on the ground, on the main street in this new neighborhood. Our vision with reuse here was to, of course, not only prompt by sustainable issues, it also addresses the collective memory that citizens of Kiruna have in their old parts of their city. The parts that now are being demolished and that soon will be gone forever. So the buildings that would be erected here in Tuolavara would become carriers of this collective memory. They would kind of shape the identity of the new neighborhood just like they shaped the old parts of Kiruna, but in configurations with a new agenda.
This leads us to a final question. When does architecture start and when does it stop? We see a need to consider architecture and its constituent elements and materials in a widened temporal framework, including the sourcing and processing of materials, maintenance, and how and where a building is eventually laid to rest. But also including what we can sense in this drawing of Tullavaara, occupancy, activities, and events. And in this sense, we guess that architecture never stops. Thank you very much.